Sometimes the ground beneath our feet holds secrets we were never meant to find. And sometimes those secrets have been waiting for us all along. When a small earthquake shook northern Utah, 67-year-old Nella Vireck discovered a tunnel hidden beneath her land. Inside, she found old journals, strange maps, and records of people who never existed. But what terrified her most was a single entry dated 5 days in the future with her name on it. How could someone from the past know what hadn't happened yet? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started the way most mornings started for Nella Vireck, with the bleating of goats and the smell of coffee percolating on the old stovetop. She stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had belonged to her husband Ben, watching the sun creep over the eastern ridge of her 40 acres. The light came slow this time of year, painting the red earth in shades of copper and rust that reminded her why she'd stayed so long after he'd passed. 12 years now. 12 years since the heart attack had taken him on a Tuesday afternoon while he was mending fence posts down by the southern property line. She'd found him there, slumped against the wire, his hat still on his head like he'd just sat down for a moment's rest. The doctors said he hadn't suffered. Nella took comfort in that, though comfort was a thin blanket those first few winters alone. But she'd survived. More than survived, she'd built something here on this isolated patch of northern Utah scrubland that most people would consider God-forsaken. Her nearest neighbor, Faye Dunmore, lived 3 miles down a dirt road that became impassable in winter. The town of Redstone, if you could call 340 souls a town, sat another 7 miles beyond that. Nella went in, once a month for supplies, sometimes less if the weather turned. She liked it that way. Always had, even before Ben died. They'd chosen this place together back in 1985, two geologists tired of university politics and grant competitions, ready to trade their reputations for peace. Ben had taken up carpentry. Nella had started raising goats, of all things. Strange career trajectory for a woman who'd spent 20 years studying seismic activity patterns across the western United States, but she'd never regretted it. The goats didn't care that she'd published 17 papers in peer-reviewed journals. They didn't care that she'd correctly predicted 3 significant earthquakes in California and Nevada, or that her work on fault line mapping had been cited in over 200 subsequent studies. The goats cared about food, water, and whether she remembered to latch the gate properly. It was honest work, and honesty mattered more the older she got. Nella was 67 now, though. Some days she felt older and some days younger. Her body worked well enough, knees a bit creaky, hands stiff in the mornings until she worked them loose. Her mind stayed sharp. She still read the geological surveys when they arrived, still kept up with current research, even though she hadn't published anything since 1998. Knowledge didn't stop being interesting just because you stopped contributing to it professionally. Her field journal from 1982 sat on the shelf above her desk, spine cracked from use, pages filled with her careful notations about subsurface formations and stress patterns. She'd mapped this entire area that summer, part of a larger regional survey. The data had been solid, unremarkable. The fault lines here were old, stable, unlikely to produce anything more than the occasional minor tremor. That's what the surveys had shown. That's what 40 years of monitoring suggested, which made this morning's earthquake all the more unusual. It had hit just after dawn, while Nella was still in bed. Not strong, maybe a magnitude 3.5, possibly 4 at the epicenter. The house had rattled for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough to wake her, not long enough to cause real concern. She'd lain there in the dark, automatically cataloguing the sensations, the initial P wave, the slower S wave following, the duration and intensity. Old habits didn't fade just because you'd left the profession. She'd gotten up, checked the house for damage none, and then walked the property as the sun rose. The goats were skittish but unharmed. The barn stood solid, the well pump still worked. Everything seemed fine until she'd walked the fence line along the northern section, where the land rose toward a low ridge of exposed red stone. There, about 60 yards from the fence, a section of hillside had collapsed inward, not a landslide, exactly. More like the earth had dropped away, leaving a depression roughly 10 feet across and maybe 6 feet deep. The edges were clean, almost geometric. Nella had approached carefully, testing the ground with each step, and peered down into the hole. That's when she'd seen it, the tunnel entrance. It wasn't natural. Even from above, she could tell that much. The opening descended at a deliberate angle, and the exposed walls showed evidence of human construction stones, fitted together, not perfectly but purposefully. Someone had built this, someone had buried it, and the earthquake had exposed it. Nella had stared at that dark mouth in the earth for a long time, her geologist's mind automatically assessing the construction, while another part of her, the part that had learned to listen to intuition over decades of fieldwork, felt something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or inevitability. She'd returned to the house, made breakfast, fed the goats, normal routines to steady herself. Then she'd gone to her office and pulled out the old property records, the surveys, the historical documents she'd accumulated over the years. Nothing mentioned tunnels. Nothing mentioned mines. Though this part of Utah had seen some prospecting in the late 1800s, nothing explained what was now sitting exposed on her land. Tommy Bridger arrived around 10, the way he did every Wednesday. Tommy was 34. Drove mail to the rural routes, and had appointed himself Nella's unofficial keeper of contact with civilization. He brought her packages, picked up items from town when she called in her list, and generally made sure she hadn't died alone in her house, which Nella appreciated, even if she sometimes found his cheerfulness exhausting. "Heard we had a little shake this morning," Tommy said, climbing out of his truck with a box of supplies she'd ordered. "Feel it out here?" "I did," Nella said, taking the box. "Woke me up. Any damage?" She hesitated. The tunnel sat just beyond the ridge, out of sight from where they stood. Something made her hold back. Nothing serious. Some things shifted. "I'll check more carefully later." Tommy nodded, accepting this. He knew she was thorough. "Well, if you need anything, you call." Faye's got her phone working again, so she can relay messages if you can't get through direct. Faye Dunmore was 72, tough as the land she lived on, and one of the few people Nella genuinely considered a friend. They spoke maybe once a week, brief conversations about weather and supplies, occasionally longer talks about books or memories. Faye understood the value of solitude and didn't push for more connection than Nella wanted to give. After Tommy left, Nella stood in her driveway for a while, looking toward the northern ridge. The rational thing would be to call someone, the county maybe, or the university. Report the discovery. Let professionals handle it. But she'd been a professional once, and she knew what would happen. They'd come in, take over her property, turn it into a research site or a tourist attraction, or God knew what else. Her privacy would evaporate. The peace she'd cultivated would be gone. Besides, something about that tunnel felt personal. She couldn't explain it, didn't try. After all these years listening to her instincts about the Earth's movements, she'd learned to trust feelings that didn't have immediate explanations. She went inside, gathered her old equipment from the barn, a sturdy backpack, her best headlamp, rope, a smaller flashlight, water, and her phone, even though service was spotty out here. She changed into her field, clothes-worn jeans, boots with good tread, a canvas jacket, the same outfit she'd worn on 1,000 geological surveys decades ago. The sun was high when she returned to the collapsed section. In daylight, the tunnel entrance looked less ominous and more intriguing. The construction was definitely old. The stones showed weathering consistent with a century or more of burial. But the workmanship was careful. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. Nella tested the edges, checking stability. Solid enough. The earthquake had revealed it but hadn't destabilized the structure. She clicked on her headlamp, shouldered her pack, and began to descend. The tunnel was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with a ceiling just tall enough for her to walk without bending. The air was cool and dry, smelling of dust and old stone. Her light revealed tool marks on the walls, hand-cut, not machine-made, definitely 19th century or earlier. She moved carefully, testing each step, aware that at 67, a broken ankle out here would be more than inconvenient. The tunnel descended at a gentle angle, heading roughly northwest into the hillside. After about 40 feet, it opened into a chamber. Nella stopped, sweeping her light around. The chamber was perhaps 12 feet square, with a ceiling that arched overhead in a way that showed considerable skill. This wasn't a rough mine shaft. This was architecture, deliberate and planned. And it wasn't empty. Against the far wall sat a copper box, maybe 18 inches long and a foot wide. The metal had tarnished to deep green, but the craftsmanship was evident even through the patina. Nella approached it slowly, her heart beating harder than the walk warranted. The box was sealed with wax, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Not Native American, not anything from the mining era she was familiar with. Something older, or at least something drawing on older traditions. She knelt beside it, set down her pack, and carefully worked the seal loose. The wax crumbled after more than a century underground. The lid resisted briefly, then opened with a sound like a whisper. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal. Nella lifted it out carefully. The cloth fell away to reveal a leather-bound book, hand-stitched, the pages thick and irregular. She opened it to the first page and read the date, the 7th of April, 1891. The handwriting was precise, old-fashioned. This record begins with the understanding that those who find it will have need of it. If you are reading this, the earth has spoken. Listen carefully. Nella read on, her headlamp casting shadows across the pages. The journal detailed earthquake predictions, dates, locations, magnitudes. She recognized several historical quakes she'd studied in her training. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906, predicted to the day. The Pleasant Valley quake of 1915, accurate within hours. Smaller tremors throughout the 1,890 seconds and into the 1,920 seconds, each carefully documented with a precision that should have been impossible without modern seismographs. The names appeared throughout: Josiah Kern, the apparent author, Temperance Vole, others she'd never heard of. They referred to themselves as Watchers, described a network spanning the western United States, mentioned something they called the Line, with a reverence that suggested deep significance. Nella's hands shook slightly as she turned the pages. This was impossible. This level of prediction accuracy, this detailed knowledge of seismic events, none of it should exist in a journal from 1891. And then she reached the final entry, dated simply 5 days hence from discovery. It read, "N.V. will face the choice that ends the waiting. What has been prepared will be offered. What has been hidden will be revealed. The line continues or it breaks. She will know which matters more." Nella stared at those initials. N.V., her initials. On a page that couldn't possibly know she existed, in a journal that shouldn't be able to predict anything. She checked her watch. The date. If discovery meant this morning when the earthquake exposed the tunnel, then 5 days from now was... She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she carefully closed the journal, placed it back in the copper box, and sat in the darkness of the chamber, with only her headlamp for company, trying to apply rational thought to something that had just shattered her understanding of what rational meant. Nella stayed in that chamber for 2 hours, reading the journal by headlamp, her scientific training warring with what the evidence clearly showed. Every prediction in the journal had come true. She verified them on her phone when she could get signal, cross-referencing dates with historical earthquake records. The accuracy was absolute. Not close, not approximate, exact. The entries were written in a careful hand, methodical and detailed. Josiah Kern, whoever he'd been, had approached this work with the precision of a trained observer. Each earthquake notation included not just date and location, but also depth, estimated magnitude, and duration. The terminology was archaic, but recognizable. This person had understood seismology before the formal science existed. Between the earthquake predictions, Josiah had written other things. Observations about the land, about patterns he'd noticed, about what he called the resonance. He described feeling the Earth's movements before they happened, sensing pressure building in the deep rock, understanding the geometry of stress and release. Nella knew that feeling. She'd experienced it herself during her career, though she'd always attributed it to professional intuition, pattern recognition from years of data analysis. The ability to look at a map and sense where stress was accumulating, where release was likely. Her colleagues had joked about her earthquake instinct, the way she could predict events slightly before the instruments registered them. Maybe it hadn't been instinct at all. The journal mentioned Temperance Vole frequently. She appeared to be Josiah's partner in this work, traveling to different sites, making observations, contributing her own insights. Other names appeared less frequently: Marcus Cole, Patience Webb, Thomas Venn, all of them watchers, all of them part of this network monitoring something they called the line. Josiah never fully explained what the line was, writing as though future readers would already know. But from context, Nella gathered it was geological, a network of connected fault lines perhaps, or a deeper pattern in the Earth's structure that these watchers had mapped and monitored. What disturbed her most was the detail about succession. Josiah wrote about it clinically. When a watcher can no longer serve, the line calls to those with the capacity. They will feel it as a pull toward the appointed places. They will find what has been left for them. The choice, as always, remains theirs. Nella thought about her decision to buy this specific property 40 years ago. She and Ben had looked at dozens of parcels. This one had felt right in a way she'd never been able to articulate. Ben had liked it for practical reasons: the water rights, the southern exposure, the decent access road. But Nella had felt something else, a sense of belonging that preceded any logical assessment, the pull toward the appointed place. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the thought. This was absurd. She was applying meaning to coincidence, pattern-seeking in randomness, a classic error in both science and human psychology. But the journal remained in her hands, solid and real, filled with predictions that had all come true. She photographed several pages with her phone, making sure to capture the final entry with her initials. Then she carefully returned the journal to the copper box and began examining the rest of the chamber. The walls were bare stone, but the floor showed evidence of other items having once been stored here. Rectangular depressions in the dust, circular marks where containers had sat. This chamber had held more than just the journal. Once, Nella found the second item in a niche she almost missed, hidden in shadow near the ceiling. She had to stand on her backpack to reach it, her knees protesting. It was another leather-bound book, smaller than the journal, wrapped in the same kind of oilcloth. She brought it down and unwrapped it carefully. This one was different, not a journal but a ledger. The pages were lined, filled with columns of dates, locations, and names. At the top of each page, a year starting with 1867 and progressing forward. Each entry listed an earthquake date, the assigned watcher, and 2 columns labeled confirmation and variance. Nella ran her finger down the entries. The confirmation column showed dates matching the earthquake predictions. The variance column showed time differences, mostly measured in minutes or hours, between prediction and actual event. The variances were small, impossibly small. Most showed differences of less than 30 minutes. Some showed exact matches, 0 variance. At the bottom of many pages, in the same careful hand, were notes: line stable, minor adjustment required, sequence maintained, sequence. That word appeared dozens of times throughout the ledger. The watchers weren't just predicting earthquakes, they were tracking a sequence, ensuring something followed a particular pattern. Nella's geological training provided context. Earthquakes weren't random. They followed patterns determined by tectonic stress, fault geometry, and previous seismic history. But those patterns were complex, chaotic in the mathematical sense. Small changes in initial conditions could produce vastly different outcomes, unless someone was managing those initial conditions. The thought was ridiculous, impossible. Humans couldn't control geological forces operating at scales of thousands of cubic miles of rock under pressures that would crush any material humans could create. But what if control wasn't the goal? What if monitoring was? What if the watchers had found a way to predict with such accuracy because they were measuring something science hadn't yet learned to detect? Nella sat back against the chamber wall, the ledger open on her lap. Her headlamp battery was getting low. She should return to the surface, think about this in daylight, apply proper analytical rigor. Instead, she kept reading. The ledger entries continued through 1923, then stopped. The final entry, dated the 15th of October 1923, showed a prediction for a magnitude 6.8 earthquake near Eureka, Nevada. The confirmation column was filled in. The earthquake had happened. But beneath it, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Final entry. No successor identified. Line maintenance uncertain. Chamber sealed pending future need. No successor." The watchers had stopped, or at least this branch of them had. The chamber had been sealed 90 years ago, left waiting for what? Someone with the capacity? Someone who would feel the pull toward the appointed place? Nella closed the ledger, returned it to its niche, and gathered her things. Her headlamp flickered, warning of imminent failure. She needed to leave, return with fresh batteries, more equipment. She needed time to think. But as she climbed back through the tunnel toward daylight, one thought kept circling: 5 days from discovery. That gave her until Saturday. The entry with her initials said she would face a choice. She emerged into afternoon sunlight that seemed harsh after the chamber's darkness. The goats bleated from their pen, wanting their afternoon feeding. Normal sounds, normal needs. She'd been underground for hours, while the world continued its ordinary business. Nella walked back to the house, her mind sorting through implications. She fed the goats mechanically, then went inside and pulled out every file she had on local seismic history. She cross-referenced the journal's predictions against the historical record, checking every single date. Perfect accuracy. Everyone. She made coffee, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop. A search for Josiah Kern, Utah, 1891, returned nothing useful. Temperance Vole produced even less. These people had left no historical trace beyond what she'd found in that chamber. Or they'd been deliberately erased from the record. Nella rubbed her eyes. She was 67 years old, had spent 4 decades studying the Earth's movements through the lens of established science. This journal, this ledger, they suggested something beyond that science, or perhaps beneath it. Something that had been known and then forgotten, or hidden. The final entry haunted her. The choice that ends the waiting. What choice? Accept some role as a watcher? Take responsibility for monitoring fault lines using methods she didn't understand? The very idea was absurd. But then, so was a journal that predicted earthquakes with perfect accuracy a century before it should have been possible. Nella closed her laptop and looked out the window at the northern ridge, where the tunnel entrance lay hidden beyond the slope. The sun was setting, painting the rocks in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere beneath that ridge, sealed in a copper box in a hand-built chamber, was a message that knew her initials, knew when she'd find it, knew she'd have to make a decision. She had 4 days to figure out what that decision was. For 3 days, Nella lived between 2 worlds. Above ground, she maintained her routines, feeding goats, managing her small homestead, responding to Tommy's weekly check-in with practiced normalcy. Below ground, in the chamber, she catalogued what she'd found with the methodical precision of her former profession. She returned to the tunnel each morning with fresh batteries, better equipment, and a growing stack of notebooks. The copper box yielded more than just the journal and ledger. Beneath them, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, she found maps, not modern maps. These were hand-drawn, executed with remarkable skill on heavy paper that had somehow survived a century underground. They showed the western United States from the Pacific coast to the Rockies, but the familiar geography was overlaid with something else, lines in red ink that connected points across hundreds of miles. Fault lines. But not the major ones she'd studied in graduate school. These were deeper, older, part of the fundamental architecture of the continent. The lines converged and diverged in patterns that suggested a network, a web of geological structure that modern seismology had only begun to map. At certain intersection points, someone had marked symbols in black ink. Nella counted 14 of them scattered across Utah, Nevada, and California. Beside each symbol, initials in tiny script. Next to one in northern Utah, approximately where she now sat, the initials read J. K. Josiah Kern. This had been his station. Nella photographed the maps, then spent an entire afternoon cross-referencing them against modern seismological data. The correlations were striking. The hand-drawn lines matched known fault patterns with uncanny accuracy, but they also suggested connections that current research was only beginning to theorize. Deep crustal structures, areas where stress transferred between different fault systems, zones where small earthquakes in one location could trigger events hundreds of miles away. The Watchers had understood this. Somehow, without modern instruments or computer modeling, they'd mapped the deep structure of the Earth's crust and identified the critical nodes where monitoring would be most effective. On the second day, Nella found Temperance Voel's ledger tucked into a crevice she'd initially missed. This one was different from the main ledger, more personal, less formal. Temperance had written observations, reflections, instructions for future watchers. "The resonance comes gradual," one entry read, "first as dreams, then as waking sensation. The deep earth speaks in frequencies below hearing, but not below feeling. Trust this. Your mind will want to dismiss it as imagination. It is not imagination. It is perception of what has always been present." Nella read this passage 3 times. Dreams. She'd been having them since the earthquake, vague impressions of pressure and movement, geometric patterns of stress and release. She'd attributed them to her subconscious, processing the journal's contents, her sleeping mind working through the implications. But maybe they were something else. Maybe they were the resonance Temperance described. The ledger included practical details too, observations about seasonal patterns, notes on which times of year brought increased seismic activity, warnings about what Temperance called cascade events, when one earthquake triggered others through the network of connected faults. Most interesting were the entries about succession. Temperance wrote about the watchers she'd known who'd grown too old to continue the work, and how the line, she always capitalized it, the line would call to someone new. Not always someone nearby, not always someone with obvious qualifications, but always someone with the capacity. "The capacity cannot be taught," Temperance had written. "It is born into certain bloodlines, sleeps until needed, wakes when the line requires it. Those with capacity will feel the pull toward appointed stations. They will know the land in ways that exceed learned knowledge. They will sense what instruments cannot yet measure." Nella thought about her career, her uncanny ability to predict earthquakes slightly before they registered on seismographs. The way certain landscapes had always felt familiar, even on first visit, the sense of connection to the land she'd bought 40 years ago, as though it had been waiting for her. She'd always attributed these things to talent, experience, professional intuition. Now another explanation presented itself, one that required accepting premises her scientific training rejected. On the third day, Tommy Bridger noticed something was wrong. He arrived with her weekly mail and a package of books she'd ordered. Nella met him at the vase door, distracted, her mind still on the maps she'd been studying. "You feeling okay?" Tommy asked, his usual cheerfulness tempered with concern. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Nella said automatically. "Just not sleeping well." "The earthquake rattle you more than you thought?" She hesitated. Tommy was a good man, reliable and discreet. Part of her wanted to tell him what she'd found, share the burden of this impossible discovery. But what would she say? That she'd found a tunnel filled with century-old predictions that all came true? That she might be part of some hereditary line of earthquake watchers? He'd think she'd lost her mind. "Something like that," she said instead. "I've been thinking about the old days, all the fieldwork Ben and I used to do." Tommy nodded, accepting this. "Well, you call if you need anything. Faye mentioned she tried phoning yesterday and didn't get through." "Phone's been acting up," Nella lied. She'd unplugged it, not wanting interruptions, while she worked in the chamber. After Tommy left, Nella stood in her driveway, watching his truck disappear down the dirt road. The isolation she'd cultivated for 12 years suddenly felt different. Not peaceful, but confining. She was sitting on a discovery that could rewrite the understanding of seismology, and she couldn't tell anyone without inviting an invasion of her privacy and peace. More than that, the final entry with her initials suggested this wasn't just an academic discovery, it was personal. A choice she had to make, though she still didn't fully understand what the choice entailed. She returned to the chamber that afternoon with a specific question in mind. The journal and ledgers described what the watchers had done, but they didn't explain how. There had to be more tools, equipment, something that enabled the precision monitoring Josiah and Temperance had achieved. Nella searched the chamber more carefully, tapping walls, checking for hidden compartments. The niche that had held Temperance's ledger was deeper than it first appeared. Nella reached in, felt around, and her fingers touched something metal. She pulled it out carefully. A brass mechanism roughly the size of her palm, intricately constructed with what looked like quartz crystals set at specific angles. Engraved on its base, "Seismic Trigger J. Kern, 1889. Nella held it up to her headlamp. The craftsmanship was extraordinary precision work that rivaled anything modern machining could produce. The brass had tarnished, but the crystals were clear, and when she tilted the device, they caught the light in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. A seismic trigger. Not a detector or a monitor, a trigger. The implications settled over her like a weight. The watchers hadn't just predicted earthquakes, they'd influenced them. Triggered small events to prevent larger ones, perhaps, or release stress gradually to avoid catastrophic build-up. She turned the device over in her hands, feeling the cool metal, the precise weight of it, and as she held it, something strange happened. The brass grew warm against her palm. Not hot, just warm, as though responding to her touch. And beneath that warmth, she felt something else. A vibration, so subtle it was almost imaginary. A frequency below hearing, exactly as Temperance had described. The resonance. Nella set the device down quickly, her heart racing. This wasn't psychological. This wasn't imagination or suggestion. The device had responded to her, and she'd felt something through it, a connection to the deep earth that shouldn't be possible. She gathered her things and climbed back to the surface, leaving the trigger device in the chamber. The sun was setting again. 3 days since the earthquake. 2 days until the deadline mentioned in that final entry, the choice that ends the waiting. Nella was beginning to understand what the choice might be, and she wasn't sure she was ready to make it. That night, Nella couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the house settle around her in ways she'd never quite noticed before. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of cooling wood, every subtle shift seemed amplified. Or maybe she was just listening differently, attuned to frequencies she'd always ignored. At 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went to her office. She pulled out the box where she kept family documents, things her mother had given her years ago, genealogical records Nella had never paid much attention to. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, old photographs in deteriorating albums. She'd never been particularly interested in family history. Her parents were both dead. She had no siblings, no children. The past had always seemed less important than the present. But now, with Josiah Kern's journal suggesting hereditary capacity, she found herself looking for connections. The photographs were frustrating, faded images of people whose names she barely knew. Her mother's family, mostly. Farmers and merchants in Utah going back to the 1870 seconds. Her father's people had come from Norway in the 1920 seconds, too recent to be relevant to this mystery. She was about to give up when she found it, tucked into an envelope, marked in her mother's handwriting. Grandmother Nella, the original. Inside was a daguerreotype, the image tarnished, but still clear enough. 5 people standing in front of a rocky hillside, dressed in the style of the 1890 seconds. The photograph was labeled on the back in careful script, "The Utah Watchers, 1891, completion of the northern station." Nella's hands shook as she held it closer to the desk lamp. The northern station. This station, her land, 3 men, 2 women. The man in the center looked to be in his 50s, bearded, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. Beside him stood a younger woman, dark-haired, her expression serious. The others were positioned slightly behind, less distinct. But it was the second woman who made Nella's breath catch. She stood at the edge of the group, her face turned partially toward the camera. High cheekbones, a distinctive widow's peak, eyes that even through the tarnish of the photograph seemed to look directly at the viewer. Nella knew that face. She saw it every morning in the mirror. She turned the photograph over. The inscription continued: Josiah Kern, Temperance Vole, Marcus Cole, Patience Webb, Nella Erickson. May the line hold true. Nella Erickson. Her great-great-grandmother, the one her mother had told stories about, the family enigma who'd disappeared in 1891, gone to live in the Utah wilderness, and never returned to civilization. Family legend said she'd been eccentric, possibly mentally unstable, that she'd chosen isolation over family. But there she was, standing with the Watchers, part of their work, and then gone. Nella searched through the rest of the documents with new urgency. She found a birth certificate for her great-grandmother, Nella Erickson's daughter, born in 1890. But no records of Nella Erickson herself after 1891, no death certificate, no burial record. She'd simply vanished from the official record the same year this photograph was taken, the year the northern station was completed. Nella set the photograph on her desk and stared at it. The resemblance wasn't just similar, it was uncanny. Same bone structure, same distinctive hairline, even the same slight asymmetry to the nose. She could have been looking at a photograph of herself in period costume, hereditary capacity, bloodlines, the line calling to those who could hear it. This wasn't random, this wasn't coincidence. Her presence on this land, her discovery of the chamber, the journal entry with her initials, it was all connected through blood and time to a woman who'd stood in the same spot 130 years ago. The first Nella. She knew, but stayed. Those words from the photograph's inscription took on new meaning. Her ancestor had known something, made a choice, and stayed with the work instead of returning to the life she'd known. What had that choice cost her? Had she been happy? Had she regretted it? Nella looked at the calendar on her wall. Friday, October 27th. The deadline was tomorrow. She made coffee, even though it was 3 in the morning, sat at her desk, and tried to think rationally through the implications. If she accepted what the evidence suggested, and that was a big if, then she was part of a hereditary line of people with some kind of sensitivity to seismic activity. The Watchers had used this sensitivity, combined with the trigger devices, to monitor and possibly influence earthquake patterns. But the watchers had disappeared. The ledger's final entry in 1923 mentioned no successor. The system had gone dormant for nearly a century. Why? What had happened to end it? And why was it restarting now with her? As dawn light began to grey, the windows, Faye Dunmore called. Nella almost didn't answer, but Faye was persistent. "Just checking on you," Faye said when Nella picked up. "Haven't heard from you in over a week." "That's not like you." "I've been preoccupied," Nella said, which was an understatement. "Everything okay out there? I thought I saw someone on your property yesterday from the road. Wasn't sure if you had visitors." Nella sat up straighter. "What kind of someone?" "Couldn't tell from distance. Just a vehicle parked up near your north ridge. Looked like. Figured it was you, but the truck looked different. Darker than yours. The north ridge. Near the tunnel entrance." "What time was this?" Nella asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Around 2, maybe 3 in the afternoon. I was coming back from town. Didn't think much of it until I realized I hadn't heard from you." Nella thanked her, promised to call more regularly, and hung up. Then she walked to the window and looked toward the northern ridge. From here, she couldn't see the tunnel entrance, but she knew exactly where it was. Someone else knew too. She dressed quickly, grabbed her truck keys, and drove across her property to the collapsed section. Fresh tire tracks marked the dirt near the fence line, not hers. Someone in a larger vehicle, probably a truck or SUV, had driven right up to the site. Nella approached the tunnel entrance carefully. The collapsed earth around it showed signs of disturbance. Someone had been here, had looked down into the opening, maybe even descended part way. They hadn't tried to hide their presence. The boot prints were clear in the dust. She climbed down into the tunnel, her heart pounding. The chamber appeared undisturbed, the copper box still in place, the trigger device where she'd left it. But someone had been here. Someone had seen what she'd found. As Nella climbed back to the surface, her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Strangers in town asking about earthquake activity in the area. Mentioned your property specifically. Thought you should know." The weight of the situation settled fully on her shoulders. The discovery was no longer private. Others were looking for this place, asking questions, coming closer. And tomorrow was the deadline. The choice that ends the waiting. Nella understood now. It wasn't just about accepting a role. It was about protecting what she'd found, deciding what happened to the Watcher's legacy. She could walk away, let whoever these strangers were take over. Or she could do what her ancestor had done, stay, and accept responsibility for something she still didn't fully understand. She looked at the tunnel entrance, at the evidence of the intruders, at the land that had been calling to her for 40 years. The choice was becoming clearer, and she was running out of time to make it. Nella spent the morning researching the strangers Tommy had mentioned. She called him back, asked for details. 3 people, he said, all in, their 40s or 50s, professional-looking. They'd stopped at the general store, asked about recent seismic activity, mentioned they were following up on historical mining claims in the area. Mining claims, a reasonable cover story for interest in old tunnels. "Did they give names?" Nella asked. "The one doing most of the talking introduced himself as Marcus Treadwell," Tommy said. "Said he was with some geological survey group, didn't catch the name of it. Marcus. The same name as one of the watchers in the 1891 photograph, Marcus Cole." Nella thanked Tommy and hung up. She pulled up the daguerreotype on her computer where she'd scanned it. Marcus Cole stood behind Josiah Kern in the photograph, younger than the others, maybe in his 30s. If this Marcus Treadwell was a descendant, that would explain his interest in the Watcher's stations. But it raised questions. Why now? Why surface after a century? What did he know that she didn't? She needed more information. The journal and ledgers told the Watcher's story from the inside, but they didn't explain what happened to end the system or who else might be looking for it. Nella returned to the chamber at noon, determined to search more thoroughly. She'd been so focused on the obvious items, the copper box, the ledgers, the trigger device, that she might have missed less obvious hiding places. She worked methodically, tapping walls, checking for hollow spaces. The chamber was approximately 12 feet square, but the walls were thick stone. There could be voids behind them, spaces deliberately concealed. After an hour of searching, she found it. A section of wall near the floor that sounded different when tapped, more hollow, less solid. She worked at the stones with her knife, carefully prying at the mortar. It was old, brittle, and after several minutes of patient effort, one stone shifted. Behind it was a cavity containing a sealed envelope made of oilcloth. Nella extracted it carefully and unwrapped the layers of protection. Inside was a letter, the paper still flexible after all these years, addressed in formal script, "To the next, Nella." Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "If you are reading this," the letter began in Josiah Kern's handwriting, "then the line has called you as we knew it would. The blood remembers what the mind forgets, and the capacity passes through generations until it finds someone who can hear its voice." Nella read on, her headlamp casting shadows across the page. "The Watchers are not prophets. We do not predict the future. We manage the present. The earth moves according to laws we do not fully understand, but we have learned to work with those movements rather than simply observe them." The letter explained what Nella had begun to suspect. The trigger devices didn't cause earthquakes, they directed seismic energy that was already building. Small, controlled releases instead of catastrophic events. The Watchers had identified critical nodes in the fault network where intervention would be most effective. "We trigger the small quakes to prevent the large ones," Josiah wrote. "The line, the network of deep faults we monitor, accumulates stress constantly. Left alone, that stress releases suddenly, destroying everything above it. We learn to release it gradually, in ways that preserve rather than destroy." The process required sensitivity to the deep earth, the ability to feel where stress was accumulating, when intervention was needed. This sensitivity was hereditary, appearing in certain bloodlines, often skipping generations. "Your ancestor, the first Nella, possessed this capacity in abundance," the letter continued. "She felt the Earth's movements more clearly than any of us. When we completed this station, she chose to stay, to maintain the work here. She lived another 40 years in these mountains, keeping the line stable until age finally claimed her. She died peacefully, knowing the work would continue." So the first Nella hadn't vanished. She'd chosen the work over conventional life, and she'd lived well. Nella felt an unexpected wave of relief at this information. Her ancestor hadn't been lost or mentally unstable. She'd made a deliberate choice and lived by it. "But the work has costs," Josiah admitted. "It requires isolation. The sensitivity to the deep earth is disrupted by the noise of cities, by crowds, by the electromagnetic chaos of modern life. It requires dedication. The line must be monitored constantly, adjusted when necessary. And it requires secrecy. Those who do not understand will fear what they cannot explain. They will try to stop the work or exploit it." There it was, the reason for the concealment, the hidden chambers, the lack of official records. "We knew the Watchers could not continue indefinitely," Josiah wrote. "The world was changing even in our time, becoming louder, more crowded, less patient with things that could not be immediately proven. We designed the stations to sleep, to wait for someone with capacity who could hear the call. If you are reading this, you have heard it. The question is whether you will answer." The letter described what acceptance would mean. Nella would need to learn to use the trigger device, to feel the resonance of the deep earth, to understand when intervention was necessary. She would need to descend regularly into the chamber where the earth's voice was clearest, away from surface noise. She would need to keep the secret, protect the station, maintain the work. "You'll feel the pull to do this," Josiah wrote. "It's already begun if you've made it this far. The resonance is calling. You can resist it, walk away, Let the line break. The earth will adjust eventually, though not kindly. Or you can accept the mantle, become what you were born to be, and keep what should be kept. The letter concluded with practical instructions: how to use the trigger device, when to descend to the deep chamber, what signs to watch for in the land and in her own awareness, and a warning. Others may come seeking what you found. Not all will understand the purpose of the work. Some will see it as interference with natural forces. Others will want to exploit it for power or profit. Trust your instincts. Protect the line. Accept help carefully. Nella refolded the letter and sat in the chamber's silence. The warning about others seeking the station seemed less abstract now, with strangers in town asking questions. She thought about Marcus Treadwell. A descendant of one of the original Watchers, perhaps, but which side was he on? Did he want to restart the work or end it? Her phone buzzed, barely any signal down here, but enough for a text to come through. It was from Faye. Those people who were asking about you, they're heading out your way. Thought you should know. Nella checked the time. 3 o'clock. She'd been in the chamber for hours. If the strangers were coming now, she had maybe 30 minutes before they arrived. She gathered Josiah's letter, the journal, the ledgers, and the trigger device. Everything that mattered. She couldn't leave it here if others knew where to look. She climbed quickly back to the surface and loaded everything into her truck. By the time she reached her house, a dark SUV was pulling into her driveway. 3 people emerged from the SUV. The man in the lead was tall, silver-haired, wearing jeans and a canvas jacket that looked expensive but practical. The other 2, a woman in her 40s and a younger man, hung back slightly, letting him take the lead. Nella met them at her porch steps. The truck bed behind her, holding everything she'd taken from the chamber, covered with a tarp. "Miss Vireck?" the silver-haired man said, extending his hand. "My name is Marcus Treadwell. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I believe we have something important to discuss." Nella didn't take his hand. "I don't discuss my property with strangers." "I understand your caution," Marcus said, lowering his hand without apparent offense. "But I'm not here about your property in the conventional sense. I'm here about what the earthquake revealed. The northern station, the term hung in the air between them. He knew. Not just about the tunnel, but about what it was." "I don't know what you're talking about," Nella said. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Please. I've spent 30 years researching the Watchers, tracking down the stations they built. My great-great-grandfather was Marcus Cole. I suspect you've seen his photograph by now, if you've found Josiah Kern's records." Nella kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced. He was a descendant, as she'd suspected. But his tone, his manner, something felt off. "The Watchers made a mistake," Marcus continued. "A well-intentioned mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. They interfered with natural processes that should have been left alone. If you're not interested in the Watchers' work, why are you here?" Nella asked. "Because the stations still exist, and people like you might try to restart them." Marcus's voice hardened slightly. "My ancestor kept journals too. He documented the psychological toll the work took on the Watchers. The isolation, the constant awareness of every tremor, the weight of responsibility for events they barely understood. Temperance Vole died in an asylum in 1927. Patience Webb took her own life in 1929. Josiah Kern disappeared in 1931, probably walked into the wilderness and never came back." Nella thought of Josiah's letter, its measured tone, its calm acceptance of the work's costs. Had he really ended that way? Or was Marcus painting a deliberately dark picture? "The Watchers broke under the weight of what they were trying to do," Marcus said. "They thought they could control geological forces that operate at scales beyond human comprehension. They were wrong. And their interference, triggering small earthquakes to prevent large ones, it doesn't work that way. You can't redistribute seismic energy like water through pipes. You just create more instability." Do you have proof of that? Nella asked. Do you have proof it works? Marcus countered. The Watcher's records show accurate predictions, yes, but that doesn't mean their interventions had the effects they claimed. Correlation isn't causation. Any geologist knows that. He was right, of course. From a scientific standpoint, the Watcher's claims would need rigorous testing to be validated. But Nella had felt the trigger device respond to her touch. She'd experienced the resonance Temperance described. There was something real here, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. What do you want? Nella asked. I want you to let me seal the northern station, Marcus said. Collapse the tunnel, destroy the devices, end this chapter permanently. The Watchers had their time. It's over. Trying to continue their work will only lead to the same psychological destruction they experienced. And if I don't agree, Marcus's expression hardened. Then I'll have to take other steps. The stations exist on private property, yes, but they represent a potential danger to public safety. If someone with no training tries to use technology they don't understand, triggering seismic events, well, there are legal avenues to address that. It was a polite threat, wrapped in concern for public safety, but Nella heard the steel beneath it. Marcus Treadwell had decided the Watcher's work should end, and he was prepared to force that outcome. I need time to think about this, Nella said. Of course, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he expected her answer to be no. We're staying in Redstone for the next few days. But I should tell you, we've located 2 other stations. Both are being sealed this week. The northern station is one of the last remaining. I'd prefer to do this with your cooperation, but I will do it regardless. He handed her a business card, then turned back to the SUV with his companions. Nella watched them drive away, then looked at the card. Just his name and a phone number. No organization, no credentials. She went inside, locked the door, and spread Josiah's letter on her kitchen table. Marcus's version of the Watcher's fate contradicted what Josiah had written about the first Nella living peacefully for 40 years. Who was telling the truth? Her phone rang. Tommy Bridger. Those people find you? He asked. They did. What did they want? Nella hesitated. Tommy had been kind to her for years, reliable and discreet, and something about Marcus Treadwell's visit made her reluctant to face this alone. Tommy, she said carefully, what do you know about the old mining tunnels in this area? There was a pause. Then Tommy said, Why don't I come over? There are some things I should probably tell you. He arrived an hour later, but instead of his usual cheerful demeanor, he looked serious. He sat at her kitchen table and looked directly at her. My grandfather was a guardian, Tommy said without preamble. That's what they called the people who helped the Watchers. My family has been involved with this for 4 generations. Nella stared at him. You knew? This whole time? I knew there was something on your land. Yes, but I didn't know you'd found it until those strangers showed up asking questions. Guardians aren't supposed to interfere. Watchers have to choose freely, without pressure. Choose what? Nella demanded. To accept the role, Tommy said. My grandfather worked with the last Watcher here, a man named Harold Venn, died in 1967. After that, the station went dormant. No one with the capacity showed up, until you bought this land 12 years ago. Why didn't you say anything? Because, like I said, you had to choose freely. If I'd told you there was a hidden chamber on your property, with devices for triggering earthquakes, you'd have thought I was crazy, or you'd have called the authorities. Either way, the station would have been compromised. And now, Marcus Treadwell is here, threatening to destroy it. And tomorrow is the deadline mentioned in Josiah's final entry, isn't it? Tommy's expression was calm but intense. I don't know exactly what that entry says, but I know the Watchers wrote predictions tied to specific dates. If tomorrow is important, then you need to decide tonight. Nella pulled out the daguerreotype and showed him the photograph. Did you know about this? Tommy studied it. My grandfather had a copy. That's Josiah Kern, Temperance Vole, Marcus Cole, Patience Webb, and—" He paused, looking at the woman who resembled Nella. "Your ancestor. She was the watcher here for 40 years. Marcus Treadwell says she died badly. Says all the watchers did." Tommy shook his head. "Marcus Treadwell is lying. His ancestor, Marcus Cole, was expelled from the watchers in 1923. He believed the work was wrong, that humans shouldn't interfere with geological processes. He spent the rest of his life trying to destroy the stations. The Treadwell family has continued that mission. So this is ideological." "It's more than that," Tommy said. "Marcus Cole kept journals too. He believed the watchers were causing earthquakes, not preventing them. He thought their interventions were making things worse. His descendants believe the same thing." "Are they right?" Nella asked. Tommy met her eyes. "I don't know. I'm not a geologist. But I know my grandfather believed in the work. He believed Harold Venn saved thousands of lives by managing the fault lines here. And I know that since the station went dormant in 1967, this region has had more seismic instability than in the previous century combined." Nella thought about the data she'd reviewed. Tommy was right. The frequency of moderate earthquakes in northern Utah had increased since the late 1960 seconds. She'd always attributed it to natural variation, but what if it was the absence of the watcher's influence? "What happens tomorrow?" Tommy asked. Nella showed him Josiah's letter, the final entry about her choice. Tommy read it carefully, then set it down. "The resonance stone is in the deep chamber," he said. "That's what they called it. The trigger device won't work at full capacity without it. You have to go deeper into the tunnel system, to where the Earth's voice is clearest." "How deep?" 300 feet, maybe more. My grandfather showed me once, when I was a kid. It's a natural cathedral of stone with a crystal formation at the center. That's where the watchers did the actual work." Nella looked at the trigger device sitting on her table. "And if I do this, I become like them? Isolated, responsible, keeping secrets?" "Maybe," Tommy said. "Or maybe you find a better way. The watchers worked alone because they had to back then. But times have changed. You don't have to do this alone." He stood up, walked to her window, and looked out toward the northern ridge. "Marcus will try to seal the station tomorrow. Tonight is your only chance to decide." Nella didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the watcher's documents, trying to make a decision that felt impossible. Accept a role she barely understood, based on century-old claims she couldn't verify? Or walk away, let Marcus seal the station, and spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd abandoned something important? At 4 a.m, she returned to the chamber one last time. She needed to see it again, feel it, understand what she was choosing to preserve or abandon. Tommy had drawn her a map showing the deeper passages. She'd never explored beyond the first chamber, but the tunnel system extended much farther into the hillside. If she was going to make an informed decision, she needed to see the deep chamber, the resonance stone he'd described. She descended with her best headlamp and the trigger device, following Tommy's map. The tunnel narrowed after the first chamber, requiring her to move carefully. The walls showed the same careful construction, hand-cut stone, fitted precisely, built to last centuries. After 20 minutes of descent, the passage opened into a larger space. Nella swept her light around and caught her breath. The deep chamber was exactly as Tommy had described, a natural cathedral, at least 30 feet across, with a ceiling that arched overhead in smooth curves. But it was the center that drew her attention. A crystalline formation rose from the floor, roughly 4 feet tall, its surfaces catching her light and reflecting it in complex patterns. The resonance stone. Nella approached it slowly. The air here felt different, denser somehow, charged with a presence she couldn't name. She set down her pack and held up the trigger device. The brass mechanism began to warm in her hand, just as it had before. But here, in the presence of the stone, the effect was stronger. The vibration she'd felt before became more pronounced, more distinct. Not quite a sound, not quite a physical sensation, something between. She stepped closer to the stone and placed her free hand on its surface. The world shifted. Nella gasped as awareness flooded through her, not vision, not hearing, but a direct perception of the Earth's deep structure. She felt the fault lines extending from this point like a web, stretching across hundreds of miles. She felt the stress accumulated at various points along that web, the pressure building, the slow movement of rock under incomprehensible force. And she felt something else. Places along the network where the stress had been managed, released in controlled ways. The pattern was clear once she could perceive it, a century of careful intervention, keeping the larger catastrophes at bay through countless small adjustments. But the pattern was failing now. Nearly 60 years without a watcher had allowed stress to accumulate in ways that were no longer stable. She could feel at critical points approaching failure, particularly along the Wasatch Front, where millions of people now lived. The awareness was overwhelming. Nella wanted to pull away, break the connection, return to the comfortable ignorance of surface life. But something held her there, not force invitation. The resonance stone wasn't trapping her. It was showing her what she needed to see, and then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Near her feet, partially hidden by the stone's base, was another journal. She hadn't seen it in the initial sweep of her light. Nella reluctantly released her connection to the stone and picked up the book. This one was different from the others, newer though still old. She opened it to the first page and saw a date, the 15th of March, 1967, Harold Venn's journal, The Last Watcher. But as she turned the A4 pages, she realized this wasn't like Josiah's careful records. Harold's entries were erratic, increasingly distressed. He wrote about the isolation, the weight of responsibility, the constant awareness of every tremor. Tommy's grandfather had been right. Harold had struggled. But it was the final entries that shocked her. They weren't written by Harold Venn at all. The handwriting changed, became familiar. Nella's handwriting. She stared at the pages, her heart pounding. Entries dated from tomorrow, October 28th forward through the next 6 months. Her own hand, describing her decision to accept the role, her first attempts to use the trigger device, her growing understanding of the deep Earth's patterns. But the entries weren't triumphant. They detailed her doubts, her loneliness, the difficulty of maintaining the work while keeping it secret. They described conversations with Tommy about whether she'd made the right choice. They mentioned Faye, growing suspicious, distant, and they stopped abruptly on April 14th with a single line. "They've found the second entrance. Marcus was right. I should have sealed it when I had the chance." Nella flipped frantically through the remaining pages. Blank, nothing after that final entry. She checked the journal's cover, turned it over, searched for any indication of how this could exist. Her own handwriting, describing events that hadn't happened yet. It was impossible, even more impossible than the earthquake predictions, because those at least were written before the events occurred. This suggested she would write these entries in the future, somehow leave them in the past. Unless, the thought struck her like a physical blow, unless time worked differently down here. Unless the deep chamber, the resonance stone, the connection to the Earth's ancient patterns, unless it allowed perception beyond the linear progression she normally experienced. Nella set the journal down carefully and looked at the stone. Again, if it could show her the deep Earth structure across space, could it also show patterns across time? Could her future self have left this warning for her present self to find? The implications were staggering. If these were truly her future entries, then she would accept the role. She would choose to become a watcher. But the choice would lead to isolation, doubt, and eventually to some kind of confrontation. When Marcus found another entrance to the station, she could prevent that. Seal the second entrance now, before accepting the role. Change the future, the journal described. But there was another possibility. These entries might not be inevitable. They might be one potential path, shown to her as a warning. The very act of reading them could change the outcomes they described. Nella gathered the journal and climbed back toward the surface, her mind reeling. She needed to talk to Tommy, show him what she'd found. This changed everything. She emerged from the tunnel. Just as dawn was breaking, Tommy's truck was already in her driveway. He'd said he'd come early, be there when she made her decision. Nella walked quickly toward the house, the journal clutched against her chest. But as she rounded the barn, she saw something that stopped her cold. Marcus Treadwell's SUV was parked next to Tommy's truck, and Tommy was standing on her porch with Marcus, the two of them deep in conversation. As Nella approached, both men turned to face her. Tommy's expression was torn, conflicted. Marcus looked grimly satisfied. "I'm sorry, Nella," Tommy said. "I tried to stop him, but he's right about some things. We need to talk before you make any decisions." Nella looked between them. "What's going on?" Marcus stepped forward. "Tommy has been honest with you about his family's role as guardians, but he hasn't told you everything, including the fact that his grandfather helped seal the other 13 stations when the Watchers network collapsed in the 1,960 seconds. Tommy's face reddened. That was different. Those Watchers had died or disappeared. There was no one to continue the work, and yet here we are, Marcus interrupted, with Nella ready to restart something that destroyed everyone who tried to maintain it. "Tommy, you know what happened to Harold Venn. You found his body yourself when you were 16. Tommy flinched as though struck. Harold died of a heart attack. At 43 years old in that chamber, alone, because the isolation and stress had destroyed his health. Marcus turned to Nella. "Is that what you want? To end up like him? Like your ancestor who spent 40 years in these mountains, cut off from normal human connection?" Nella held up the journal with her future entries. "I found something else in the deep chamber, my own handwriting, describing the next 6 months, including a warning about a second entrance you're going to find." Both men stared at her. Tommy spoke first. "That's impossible. So is a journal predicting earthquakes a century before they happen," Nella said. "But here we are. The question is, what do I do with this information?" Marcus's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern. "May I see it?" Nella hesitated, then handed him the journal. Marcus read the entries carefully, his face growing increasingly troubled. "This confirms everything I've warned you about," he said finally. "Look at what you write, the doubt, the isolation, the strain. And it ends with you regretting the choice to accept the role. Please, Nella, learn from this. Don't make the same mistake." But Nella was looking at Tommy, who had taken the journal and was reading more carefully. "Wait," Tommy said. "These entries they describe using the trigger device alone, working without help. Nella, what if the mistake isn't accepting the role, but accepting it the way the old Watchers did, in complete isolation?" He looked up at her, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or hope. "My family were guardians," Tommy continued. "That was always the role, to help the Watchers, to share the burden. But the guardians disappeared along with the Watchers. What if we restarted both? Not you alone, but you with support." Marcus shook his head. "You're rationalizing, trying to make something fundamentally broken seem fixable. The Watchers failed, Tommy. All of them. Adding helpers doesn't change the core problem. Humans can't manage geological forces we barely understand." "We barely understood flight once too," Nella said quietly. "We barely understood electricity, or medicine, or 1,000 other things we've learned to work with. Just because something is difficult doesn't mean it's impossible." She took the journal back and looked at her future handwriting. The entries described one path, not the only path. If she accepted the role but changed how she approached it, worked with Tommy instead of alone, maintained connections instead of isolating herself, maybe even found a way to bring modern science to bear on what the Watchers had learned, maybe The future could be different than what her warnings described. They moved inside, away from the cold morning air, and spread everything on Nella's kitchen table. The journals, the ledgers, the maps, the trigger device, and most importantly, the entries written in her own hand, describing a future she hadn't yet lived. Marcus studied the maps with a professional eye. These fault lines, some of them match current geological understanding, but others... He traced a red line with his finger. This deep crustal connection between the Wasatch and the Sierra Nevada, we've only recently begun to theorize about this. How did they know in 1891? They felt it, Tommy said. The watchers had sensitivity to seismic patterns that exceeded what instruments could measure. My grandfather described it as hearing a song that was always playing, but that most people were deaf to. That's not science, Marcus said. That's mysticism. It's both, Nella said. She'd been thinking about this all night, trying to reconcile her training with what she'd experienced. Human perception can detect patterns that instruments miss. We've documented this in other fields, weather forecasting, medical diagnosis, even mechanical engineering. Experienced practitioners develop intuitions that prove accurate even when they can't articulate the reasoning. She pointed to the trigger device. This is a tool for focusing that intuition, making it practical. The brass and crystal configuration. It's not random. Someone understood resonance, harmonic frequencies, perhaps even piezoelectric effects, a century before we had the theory to explain them. Marcus picked up the device, examining it closely. Even if I grant that, even if the watchers had genuine sensitivity to seismic patterns, that doesn't mean their interventions worked. Triggering small earthquakes might feel like you're releasing pressure, but the Earth doesn't work that way. Fault systems are too complex, too interconnected. Changing one variable creates unpredictable cascades. Then explain this, Tommy said, pulling out the ledger with its detailed records of predictions and confirmations. 99% accuracy over 6 decades. If they were making things worse, wouldn't we see increasing instability during their active period? We can't know that, Marcus countered. We don't have reliable seismic records from that era to compare against. Actually, we do. Nella pulled out her laptop and opened files she'd compiled over the past few days. I've been cross-referencing the watchers' records against every documented earthquake in the western United States from 1867 to 1967. During the period when the watchers were active, the frequency of major earthquakes, magnitude 6.5 or higher, was significantly lower than in the decades before or after. She turned the screen so both men could see the graph. Here's the baseline from 1840 to 1867 before the watchers organized their network. Average of 2.3 major quakes per year. From 1867 to 1923, when the watchers were at full capacity, 0.7 per year. After 1967, when the last station went dormant, back up to 2.1 per year. Marcus leaned forward, studying the data. This could be natural variation. Seismic cycles operate over centuries. Could be, Nella agreed. But look at this. She pulled up another graph showing moderate earthquakes, magnitude 4 to 6. During the watchers' period, moderate quakes increased by 40%. That's consistent with their stated approach, triggering many small releases to prevent large ones. Tommy grinned. You've been doing research. I'm a geologist, Nella said. Or I was. This is what I do. Analyze data, look for patterns, and the patterns suggest the watchers were doing something that had measurable effects. Marcus sat back, his expression conflicted. Even if they succeeded, that doesn't make it right. The psychological cost was high because they worked in isolation, Tommy interrupted. Look at Nella's future entries, the ones that describe working alone. But we're not proposing that. We're proposing a different model. Nella nodded. Tommy works as guardian, handling surface logistics, providing support. I maintain the monitoring and make the technical decisions. But I don't disappear into the earth like my ancestor did. I stay connected to the world above. And when you're 67 years old and feeling the weight of responsibility for preventing earthquakes that might kill thousands of people, Marcus asked quietly, when you're losing sleep because you can sense stress building in a fault line 300 miles away, when normal life starts to feel trivial compared to the deep Earth's movements, what then? It was a fair question. Nella thought about Harold Venn dying at 43, alone in the deep chamber, about Temperance Vole in an asylum, about the toll this work had taken on people who dedicated their lives to it. I'm already 67, Nella said. I've already lived most of my life. My husband is dead. I have no children. The isolation you're warning about, I chose it 12 years ago when Ben died. This work wouldn't be taking me away from a full, connected life. It would be giving purpose to the solitude I already have. Tommy nodded. And she wouldn't be alone. My family has been waiting 3 generations for this. I'm not going anywhere. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the northern ridge. For a long moment, he was silent. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more conflicted. My great-great-grandfather kept journals too, he said. Marcus Cole wrote about the Watchers with respect, even after they expelled him. He didn't believe they were evil or insane. He believed they were wrong, that human intervention in geological processes was hubris, that we couldn't possibly understand the long-term consequences of what we were doing. He turned back to face them. But he also wrote that if the Watchers were right, if their work really did prevent catastrophic earthquakes, then stopping them would lead to disaster. He spent the last 20 years of his life terrified that he'd made the wrong choice, that his ideological opposition had condemned people to death. Then why continue his mission? Nella asked. Because we can't know, Marcus said. That's the fundamental problem. We can't run the experiment both ways. We can't compare a world with Watchers to a world without them and see which is better. All we have are correlations, incomplete data, and the testimonies of people who might have been self-deceiving. He pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph. A page from what looked like an old journal, the handwriting shaky but legible. This is from Marcus Cole's final entry, written 3 days before he died in 1947, Marcus said. He wrote, "If I am wrong, if the Watchers were right and I have undone their work, then I pray someone with clearer sight and greater courage will restart it. The earth keeps its own counsel. Perhaps we were meant to be its voice after all." The room fell silent. Tommy was the first to speak. "So you're not actually opposed to the Watchers' work. You're opposed to uncertainty." "I'm opposed to people destroying themselves, pursuing something that might be futile," Marcus said. "But," he looked at Nella, "you've done more rigorous analysis in 3 days than my family has done in 3 generations. If you're going to restart this, at least you're approaching it scientifically. Does that mean you'll stop trying to seal the station?" Nella asked. Marcus hesitated. "It means I'll give you a chance. But I want to monitor the results. If you accept this role, I want regular reports, data on what you're sensing, what interventions you make, what the outcomes are. Treat this like the experiment it is. Document everything." "That was always my plan," Nella said. "And if the data shows negative effects, if you're making things worse, you agree to stop?" Nella nodded. "Agreed." Tommy grinned. "So we're really doing this?" "Not yet," Nella said. She held up the journal with her future entries. "First, we need to find the second entrance this warns about. If there's another way into the station, it needs to be secured before I accept the role. Otherwise, we'll be dealing with security issues on top of everything else." Marcus studied the maps. "Do you have any idea where it might be?" Nella traced the lines showing the tunnel system. The passages extend northwest from the main chamber, descending toward the deep chamber. If there's a second entrance, it would likely be somewhere along this slope. She pointed to an area on her property about a quarter-mile from the existing entrance. There's an old mine shaft in that area, Tommy said. Been sealed since before I was born. My grandfather mentioned it once, said it went deeper than most people knew. That's it, Nella said. Has to be. The Watchers would have connected their tunnel system to an existing mine, hidden their work inside something that already had a legitimate explanation for being there. Marcus was already standing. We should check it now. If that entrance is accessible, anyone could have found it. They drove across Nella's property in her truck, following Tommy's directions to the old mine site. The entrance was partially collapsed, covered with rusted metal plates and warning signs dating back to the 1970 seconds. But when they examined it more closely, they found fresh marks in the dust. Someone had been here recently, had moved the plates slightly to peer inside. Marcus, Nella said quietly, are your people the only ones who've been searching for the Watchers' stations? Marcus's expression darkened. No. There are others. Collectors, mostly. People who hear rumors about the Watchers and want to find the devices, the journals. Some are just curious. Others, he paused, others believe the trigger devices could be weaponized. Tommy pulled out his phone. We need to seal this. Now, before anyone else finds it. They spent the next 3 hours working together, Marcus, Tommy, and Nella, reinforcing the mine entrance, placing new barriers, making it as inaccessible as possible without drawing attention to it. Marcus contributed materials from his SUV, professional-grade locks and chains. As they worked, Nella felt something shift. These weren't adversaries anymore. They were collaborators, each bringing different knowledge and skills to a shared problem. By noon, the second entrance was secured. They stood back, sweating despite the cool October air, and surveyed their work. That should hold, Marcus said. At least for a while. Nella checked her watch. October 28th. The deadline day. The day her future. Entries began. In those entries, she'd accepted the role alone, worked in isolation, made mistakes that led to regret. But that future wasn't inevitable. She'd changed it already by finding the second entrance, by working with Marcus instead of against him, by planning to approach this as a collaborative project rather than a solitary burden. I'm ready, Nella said. Let's go to the deep chamber. They descended together, Nella, Tommy, and Marcus, each carrying equipment and lights. The tunnel felt different with company, less isolating, more like a journey they were sharing than a solitary burden. Tommy had brought additional rope and safety equipment. Marcus carried surveying tools, a digital recorder, and a notebook. Nella had the trigger device and Josiah's instructions. The deep chamber was exactly as she'd left it hours earlier. The resonant stone rose from the center, its crystalline surfaces catching their lights and scattering them in complex patterns across the walls. Marcus approached it slowly, reverently. This is remarkable. Natural formation, or both, Nella said. The stone is natural, but someone shaped it. Look at these facets. They're too regular to be random weathering. The Watchers carved it to enhance its natural properties. She showed him the carved niche where the trigger device was meant to rest, positioned precisely in relation to the stone. It's like a lens and a detector combined. The stone amplifies the deep Earth's resonance, the device focuses it, and the person with capacity, the Watcher, interprets and directs it. And you're certain you have this capacity? Marcus asked. Instead of answering, Nella placed the trigger device in its niche. Immediately, it began to warm, to vibrate with that sub-audible frequency she'd learned to recognize. She placed her hands on the stone. The awareness flooded through her again, but this time she was prepared for it. The vast network of fault lines, the stress, patterns, the slow movements of the deep earth, All of it became perceptible in a way that transcended normal senses. She could feel the Wasatch Fault, its enormous length running north-south through Utah. Stress accumulating at multiple points along its length, particularly near populated areas. Salt Lake City, Provo, Ogden, all sitting directly atop a fault system that was overdue for a major release. "Tell me what you're sensing," Marcus said, his voice distant through the resonance. Nella tried to put it into words. "The Wasatch, there are 3 critical stress points, one near Brigham City, one near Nephi, one south of Salt Lake. The stress has been building for 60 years without intervention. It's approaching critical thresholds. Can you be more specific?" Marcus was taking notes, recording her words. "The Brigham City section stress equivalent to a magnitude 5.8 event. But it's locked, not releasing naturally. If it goes, it'll trigger the other sections. Cascade, failure, total release could be magnitude 7.2 or higher." Tommy whistled softly. "That would devastate the entire Wasatch Front." "When?" Marcus asked. Nella concentrated, feeling the patterns. This was what Josiah had described, not just sensing current stress, but understanding the progression, the rate of accumulation, the point at which the system would fail. "Within 6 months," she said, "maybe sooner. The system is critically unstable." She felt Marcus and Tommy exchange glances, though she couldn't see them through the resonance. Her awareness was turned inward and downward, toward the deep earth. "Can you do anything about it?" Tommy asked quietly. Nella focused on the trigger device. She could feel it responding to her intention, creating a focal point for the resonance. Josiah's instructions had described the process: identify the stress point, establish resonance with it, create a pathway for controlled release. "I can trigger a release at the Brigham City section," Nella said. "A small one. Magnitude 3.5, maybe 4. It won't eliminate the stress completely, but it'll reduce it enough to delay the major event." "Do it," Marcus said. Then, more carefully, "if you're sure." Was she sure? This was the moment. The choice Josiah's entry had predicted. Accept the role of watcher, take active responsibility for managing seismic forces, or walk away and let nature take its course. But it wasn't really a choice, was it? Not when she could feel the stress building, sense the coming disaster, know that hundreds of thousands of people lived in the path of what would happen if she did nothing. Nella adjusted her connection to the trigger device, focusing her awareness on the Brigham City stress point. She felt the pathway between the deep chamber and that distant section of fault, felt how the resonance could be directed along it. Carefully, precisely, she released a small amount of the accumulated stress. The deep chamber trembled slightly. Not violently, just a subtle vibration, like a tuning fork being struck. The resonant stone sang with it, a sound below hearing, but felt in the bones. 70 miles away, instruments at the University of Utah would be recording a magnitude 3.8 earthquake centered near Brigham City. Minor damage, if any. No injuries. Just a small tremor that would be noted in the daily seismic log and quickly forgotten. But Nella felt the release, felt the stress along that fault section decrease, felt the danger recede. Not eliminated, but delayed. Managed. She'd done it. Her first intervention as a watcher. And the earth, in its vast indifference, accepted the adjustment and continued its slow movements, untroubled by human involvement in its ancient rhythms. Nella released her connection to the stone slowly, carefully, letting the awareness recede like a tide going out. The deep chamber came back into focus, the physical space, the lights, Tommy and Marcus, watching her with expressions of awe and concern. "Did it work?" Tommy asked. "Check the seismic monitors," Nella said, her voice hoarse. The experience had been more intense than she'd expected, more draining. Marcus was already on his phone, though signal was weak this deep. He climbed partway back up the tunnel until he could connect to the university's real-time earthquake data, magnitude 3.8. He called down, "Brigham City area. Recorded it, he checked his watch. Exactly when you said you were releasing it. Tommy helped Nella sit down against the chamber wall. She felt exhausted, as though she'd been physically working for hours instead of simply standing with her hands on a stone. How do you feel? Tommy asked. Tired, Nella admitted. But she searched for words. Complete, like I'd been missing something my whole life, and just found it. Marcus returned. His expression conflicted. The earthquake you triggered it was felt across 3 counties. Minor damage reports are already coming in. Broken windows, items fallen from shelves. Nothing serious. But, he paused, you just caused an earthquake that affected thousands of people. I prevented one that would have killed thousands, Nella countered. That's the calculation, isn't it? Small harms to prevent larger ones? That's the rationalization, Marcus said. But how do you know? How do you know the major earthquake would have happened? Maybe the stress would have released gradually on its own. Maybe your intervention just caused unnecessary damage. It was the fundamental question he'd been asking all along, the one that had driven his ancestor to break with the Watchers, the one that had no perfect answer. I can't prove it, Nella said. Not in a way that would satisfy a scientific peer review. But I felt the stress patterns. I understood the progression, and every instinct I've developed over 40 years of studying seismology told me that fault section was approaching critical failure. She stood up, steadier now. You wanted data. You wanted this treated like an experiment. Fine. Monitor the Wasatch Fault over the next 6 months. Track the stress patterns. See if the section I just released shows different behavior than the sections I didn't touch. That's your control group. Marcus nodded slowly. All right, I'll set up monitoring. But Nella, his voice was serious, if the data shows you're making things worse, you have to stop. We agreed. We did, Nella confirmed. I'm a scientist. I follow the data wherever it leads. Tommy was examining the trigger device, the resonance stone, the careful architecture of the chamber. How often will you need to do this? The interventions. Nella thought about what she'd sensed, the patterns across the entire fault network. Not constantly. The stress builds slowly, over weeks or months. I'll need to monitor regularly, probably descend to this chamber once a week to check the patterns. But actual interventions, maybe, once a month, if that. That's manageable, Tommy said. You can maintain a normal life above ground, come down here when needed. It doesn't have to consume everything the way it did for the old Watchers. The old Watchers didn't have cell phones or computers, Marcus added. They couldn't coordinate, couldn't share data across stations. They were isolated by technology as much as by choice. An idea was forming in Nella's mind. What if we didn't treat this as one station working alone? What if we found the other stations, identified people with capacity, rebuilt the network the way the Watchers originally intended? Marcus's expression shifted from skepticism to something more complex. You're talking about restarting the entire system. Why not? You said you've located the other stations. Some must still be intact. And if capacity is hereditary, there must be others like me, descendants of the Watchers, people who've felt the pull toward these places without understanding. Why? It took the original Watchers decades to build their network, Marcus said. They didn't have the internet, Nella countered. They didn't have genealogical databases, seismological networks, instant communication. We could do in months what took them years. Tommy was nodding enthusiastically. My family kept records, guardian families, where they were located, who they served. Some of those families are still around. We could contact them, see if anyone has felt what you're feeling. Marcus sat down on the chamber floor, thinking. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he pulled out his phone, no signal here, but he opened his notes app and began typing. I know where 7 of the stations are, he said finally. I've spent years tracking them down, planning to seal them. Instead, he looked up at Nella, instead, I'll help you find them. Help you find people who might have capacity. But on one condition. What condition? Nella asked. I document everything. Full scientific rigor. Data collection, analysis, peer review eventually. If we're going to restart this, we do it right. We prove it works, or we prove it doesn't. No more mystery. No more hidden knowledge. We bring this into the light. Nella extended her hand. Deal. Marcus shook it, his grip firm. Then I guess I'm a guardian now too, or maybe a skeptical collaborator. We'll see what the data says. Tommy laughed. Welcome to the strangest research project in geological history. They climbed back toward the surface together, discussing plans, next steps, who to contact first. The sun was setting when they emerged, painting the Utah landscape in shades of amber and rust. Nella stood at the tunnel entrance, looking out across her land. 40 years ago, she'd felt the pull toward this place. 12 years ago, she'd returned after Ben's death, seeking solitude. And now, today, she'd accepted a role that connected her to something deeper than she'd imagined, a lineage of watchers, a network spanning generations, a responsibility for the deep Earth's movements. 3 weeks later, Nella stood in her kitchen making coffee while Tommy read the latest seismic data from his laptop. The routine had become familiar Tuesday mornings. They reviewed the week's monitoring results, planned the next chamber descent, discussed findings with Marcus via video call. The Brigham City section is stable, Tommy reported. Stress levels continuing to decrease gradually, exactly as you predicted. Nella smiled. The data was validating her intervention, showing that the controlled release had accomplished what she'd intended. More importantly, the other sections of the Wasatch Fault, the ones she hadn't touched, showed different patterns. Stress continuing to accumulate, approaching critical levels, the control group Marcus had requested. Her phone buzzed. A text from Faye Dunmore. Still coming for lunch Sunday? I'm making that stew you like. Nella typed back. Wouldn't miss it. Her isolation hadn't ended when she'd accepted the watcher's role, but it had transformed. Instead of being alone by default, she was choosing connection when it mattered. Tommy's weekly visits had expanded to include his wife and kids sometimes. Faye called more often, stopped by on her trips to town. Even Marcus had become something like a friend, his skepticism evolving into cautious collaboration. The work itself had settled into a rhythm. Weekly descents to the deep chamber, brief connections to the resonance stone to monitor the fault network, occasional interventions when stress patterns warranted it. The process was demanding but not consuming. Nella still fed her goats, maintained her property, read her books, but now she did it with purpose, beyond simple routine. The journal with her future entries sat on her desk, a reminder of the path she'd avoided. Those entries had described working alone, growing isolated, making mistakes. But she'd changed that. Future by choosing differently, by accepting help, by staying connected. Marcus's research project was expanding. He'd identified 3 more people with potential capacity, all descendants of the original Watchers, all reporting the same sense of connection to specific locations, the same dreams of deep Earth movements. 2 had agreed to explore the stations near their properties. 1 had politely declined, choosing instead to document her family's history for Marcus's records. There was no pressure, no obligation. The choice remained free, as Josiah had intended. Nella had started her own journal, carefully documenting each intervention, each observation, each pattern she noticed in the deep Earth's behavior. Not for herself, but for whoever might come after her. Whether that was next year or 50 years from now, they would have better information than she'd started with. They would understand the choice they were making. Her entries were different from the ones in the future journal. More hopeful, more connected. The loneliness that had characterized those other entries was absent here, replaced by collaboration and shared purpose. Tommy closed his laptop and accepted the coffee Nella handed him. Marcus wants to bring in a seismologist from the university, someone we can trust, who can analyze the data independently. Good, Nella said. We need Outside verification. This can't just be us telling ourselves it's working. Nervous about it? Nella considered. A little. But mostly I'm curious. I want to know if what I'm sensing has objective correlates in the data. If we can develop a hybrid approach combining traditional seismology with the Watcher's methods, we might understand the Earth's movements better than either approach alone. It was the scientist in her, still seeking validation, still wanting to understand. But now that drive was balanced by direct experience, by the certainty of what she felt when connected to the resonance stone. Both were true, the measurable data and the felt sense. Both mattered. The sun was rising higher, warming the October morning. Nella walked to her window and looked toward the northern ridge where the tunnel entrance lay hidden. From here, it was invisible, just another section of red earth and stone. But she knew it was there, knew what lay beneath it, knew her place in the continuity of Watchers spanning generations. She thought about her ancestor, the first Nella, standing in almost this same spot 130 years ago, making her choice to stay, to accept the work, to become part of something larger than herself. Had she been happy? The new information suggested, yes, 40 years of service, death from natural causes at a good age, peacefully integrated into the land she'd monitored. Not tragedy, not madness, just a life lived with purpose, even if that purpose was hidden from history books. Nella's reflection in the window showed a 67-year-old woman who looked tired but content. Her widow's peak, inherited through generations, marked her as part of the lineage. Her hands, weathered from years of field work and farm labor, were steady. Her eyes, still sharp, looked toward the future with something that felt like hope. "Ready for this week's descent?" Tommy asked, gathering his equipment. "Always," Nella said. They drove across her property to the tunnel entrance, the morning light painting everything in shades of amber. The goats bleated from their pen, wanting breakfast. Normal sounds, normal needs, life continuing above ground, while the work below remained hidden, protected, maintained. At the tunnel entrance, Nella paused. 5 weeks ago, the earthquake had exposed this place. 5 weeks ago, she'd descended alone into darkness, uncertain and afraid. Now she descended with purpose, with partnership, with understanding. The earth spoke in frequencies below hearing. The Watchers listened and responded. The line continued, connecting past to present to future, deep earth to surface life, individual choice to collective responsibility. Nella clicked on her headlamp and began the descent, Tommy following close behind. The deep chamber waited, the resonant stone ready to reveal what needed to be known. Above them, the land she'd chosen 40 years ago continued its slow movements, patient and ancient. And Nella Vireck, 67 years old, former geologist, goat farmer, and now watcher of the northern station, went to do the work that had been waiting for her all along.